It was supposed to be a quiet winter morning in Santon. The sky was still soft with early light, and a thin layer of frost shimmered on the grass at Central Park. Richard Silas Langston, a wealthy businessman in his early 60s, was on his usual walk. Hands in pockets, coat buttoned to the collar, breath rising in little clouds before him. His life was predictable, controlled, empty, though he wouldn't say it out loud. Ever since his daughter passed away in a tragic accident, he had kept his heart locked behind thick doors. The mansion was silent, the fireplace rarely lit, the dining table always set for one. But that morning something shifted. As he walked past an old wooden bench beneath a tall oak, something caught his eye, a pile of blankets perhaps. But then, it moved. He paused, frowned, and stepped closer. There, curled up and barely conscious, was a teenage girl. Her clothes were worn thin, her skin pale. And beside her, 3 tiny infants wrapped in whatever scraps she could find. The babies were crying, their cheeks pink with cold, little fists trembling. One let out a raspy cough. Silas's breath caught, his instincts overruled thought. He scooped up the children one by one, holding them close against the wool of his coat, then gently lifted the girl into his arms. She was feather light. Her head lolled against his shoulder. People stared as he hurried to his car, a billionaire cradling 4 strangers. But he didn't care. Back at the mansion, the black iron gates creaked open. The inside was still, touched only by the scent of polished wood and old books. But something changed the moment he stepped in. "Nandi!" he called, breathless. The housekeeper of nearly 2 decades came rushing, apron on, flower on her hands. Her eyes widened. "Oh Lord, babies?" No time to explain. Warm water, blankets, Dr. Jacobs, now. They moved like clockwork. The babies were laid near the fireplace, wrapped in soft quilts. The girl, Amala, was placed gently on the long, cream-colored sofa by the window. The fire crackled alive, throwing golden light across the room. The kitchen began to fill with the scent of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, a habit Nandi kept for cold mornings. When Dr. Jacobs arrived, his expression was grim. "She's dehydrated, low blood sugar, severe exhaustion. The babies are underweight, but they're alive." Silas sat down beside the sleeping girl, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but something in her presence, something about the way those babies had clung to her even in sleep. He whispered, "They're safe now. That's all that matters." Later that day, as snow began to fall lightly outside, the girl stirred. She blinked up at the soft yellow light from a bedside lamp and the sound of quiet jazz drifting from the next room. For a moment she looked confused, then terrified. "The babies!" she gasped, bolting upright. "There," a calm voice said. Silas stood by the doorway, a warm mug in his hand. "They're all right, sleeping by the fire." She rushed to the crib, tears spilling freely as she gathered the little ones into her arms. "Please don't take them from me," she choked out. "We didn't steal anything. I just wanted them to live." "No one's taking anything," Silas said gently. "You were alone. You did what you had to." She sank to her knees, still clutching the babies. "I'm Amala," she whispered. "They're not mine. They're my siblings. Mama, she didn't make it. She bled too much during birth. And my stepfather left before the funeral." Silas knelt down beside her, not touching, just listening. "And so you took care of them," he said softly. Yes, I tried staying in school, but they cried all night. I couldn't focus, I dropped out, found cleaning jobs, begged for food. Her voice cracked. We ended up at a shelter, then on the streets. I fed them first. Sometimes all I had was water. Silas looked at her, this young woman who had carried more than most adults ever would. "You're brave," he said, his voice almost a whisper. In the days that followed, something changed in the house. It was no longer silent. Laughter began to drift down the halls. The smell of fresh bread and baby powder replaced the stale stillness of grief. One evening, Silas knocked softly on her door. "May I?" Amala nodded. She was reading beside the fireplace, the babies bundled up in the corner crib. "I did some digging," he began. "Your mother, her name, Nomvula. I knew it sounded familiar." Amala looked up, surprised. "She worked for me years ago, just a cleaner. But one day during a company picnic, my daughter Ayanda slipped and fell into the pool. No one noticed, except Nomvula. She jumped in fully clothed and pulled her out, saved her life." Tears welled in Amala's eyes. "She never told me. She wouldn't have. She was humble, quiet, but I never forgot her." Silas's voice faltered. "My daughter died 2 years later. Car accident. I wasn't there. I've lived in silence ever since, but seeing you, that day in the park, something cracked open again." They sat in silence. "You know," Amala said, voice soft, "maybe my mother gave you your daughter back that day. And now, maybe your daughter gave me you." Months passed. The babies grew stronger. Amala began taking online classes, slowly rekindling her dreams. Silas, once a man of numbers and stock reports, now spent evenings rocking babies, helping with spelling games and laughing again. One chilly morning, Amala handed him a crayon drawing. It showed a man holding hands with 3 little children. Above it, in shaky letters, "Baba." Silas stared, stunned. "She calls you that," Amala said quietly. "Father." He didn't speak, just held the drawing to his chest as tears slid down his cheeks. Later that week, he sat across from Amala in the sunroom, the light pouring in through the frosted windows. "I want to adopt them," he said simply. "Make it official. Give them the name, the future they deserve." Amala could barely speak. "You don't have to say yes," he added, "but I want them to know what it means to belong, to be chosen." A year later, the house was full of warmth, of music, of life. The fireplace crackled as the babies, now toddlers, tumbled on the rug, giggling. Nandi hummed as she placed ginger cookies on a tray. Amala walked in, college books under one arm, a fresh breeze of confidence in her step. "You're home," Silas smiled. "I'm home," she nodded, and she meant it. Because family isn't just where you're from. Sometimes family is who chooses to love you exactly when you need it most. Spring came gently to Santon. The snow had melted, and the garden behind Silas's house, once bare and brittle, now bloomed with daffodils and soft green leaves. The birds returned, nesting under the eaves, their songs threading through the quiet mornings like gentle reminders. Life goes on. Inside the house, warmth was no longer just from the fire. It came from laughter, from shared breakfasts, from the sound of little feet padding across the floor. Silas had taken to making pancakes on Sundays, wearing a ridiculous checkered apron that Nandi insisted on teasing him about. "Never thought I'd see the day," she chuckled one morning, flipping through a worn recipe book. "You in the kitchen, sir?" Silas grinned. "Neither did I." Amala had found a rhythm. She took classes in the mornings, curled up in the sunroom with her laptop and a steaming mug of cocoa. Sometimes Silas would join her, reading the paper nearby, the two of them enjoying a silence that felt companionable. In the afternoons, she played with the triplets, now walking, babbling, full of energy. Boule loved books. Luand had a thing for crayons in the hallway walls. Anathi was the quiet one, always curling up in Amala's lap like a cat. Some nights Amala would rock them to sleep while Silas read aloud from old children's books, his voice low and steady like thunder in the distance. Once the babies were asleep, Amala would light a candle in the kitchen and sit with Silas over chamomile tea. They talked about the future, about grief, about starting again, and sometimes they didn't talk at all. Just sat, as if being seen, being near was enough. One evening a storm rolled in. The windows rattled. The fireplace crackled louder than usual. Silas found Amala standing at the glass, watching the rain. "I still get scared," she said, "when it storms. Reminds me of the shelter, of nights with no roof, just hope." Silas came beside her. "You're not there anymore." "I know," she turned to him. "But sometimes I still feel like that girl on the bench." "You're more than her now," he said gently. "But don't ever be ashamed of her. She's the one who carried your siblings through the storm. She's the reason they're alive." Amala looked up at him, this man who had once lived behind cold gates and heavy silence, and now here he was reminding her of her strength. That night she slept easier. Summer arrived like a soft sigh. The baby's laughter echoed through open windows. Amala passed her first year of college with flying colors. Silas started a small scholarship fund in her mother's name, the Nomvula Foundation, for young single caretakers who'd fallen through the cracks. Nandi cried when she saw the name printed on the letterhead. "You're keeping her memory alive," she whispered. "You're making something beautiful from sorrow." One afternoon, as golden light spilled through the back door, Amala stepped out into the garden where Silas was trimming the hedges. Something he said helped him think. "I've been thinking," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "about becoming a social worker." Silas looked up, surprised, then nodded slowly. "I think you'd be very good at that. I want to help kids like me, the ones no one sees." "You were seen," he said, "and now you'll help others be seen too." She smiled, her heart steady. The house smelled of vanilla cake and fresh-cut flowers. Photos lined the mantel of the triplets at the park, Amala in her college sweatshirt, Silas holding Anathi with the same awe he'd once reserved for boardroom victories. Family had come over, friends too. The living room was filled with warm chatter and soft jazz playing from an old record player in the corner. In the middle of it all, Amala stood with a diploma in one hand and a toddler hanging off her hip. Silas raised a glass. "To second chances," he said, voice full, eyes bright, "to the little moments that save us, and the people who remind us what love looks like." Everyone clapped, but it was Amala's eyes that held the true celebration, soft with memory, strong with grace. She looked at Silas, and without needing to say it, he knew. "Thank you for seeing me." By the time autumn painted the trees in hues of gold and amber, the house no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like a home. There were still quiet days, days when the weight of memory would settle on Silas's shoulders like the fallen leaves in the garden. But now, he didn't carry it alone. He and Amala had formed a rhythm, like old jazz, the kind you sway to without thinking, not perfect but real, full of pauses, of harmony. On Sunday afternoons, they sat on the wide porch, wrapped in woolen shawls, sipping spiced cider as the kids tumbled through piles of leaves, their laughter like wind chimes. Sometimes Silas would read aloud from Amala's sociology textbooks, pretending to sound intellectual just to make her laugh. She always did. "Dad," one of the babies, now a confident 3-year-old, called out one day, dragging a book toward him. It was the first time she'd said it like it meant him, not just a word. He paused, then smiled so softly it could have cracked your heart. "Yes, sweetheart." One crisp evening, Amala stood by the kitchen window. The scent of roasted butternut squash filled the air. Tiny candles flickered on the dining table, casting golden reflections in the glass. She watched as Silas helped Boule learn to tie her shoes, patient and gentle, his gray hair catching the last light of day. Behind them on the fridge was the same crayon drawing from long ago, now faded, corners curled. Baba and the babies. She turned back to the stove, stirring soup, and let herself smile. Not because life had been easy, it hadn't, but because it had been redeemed. That night, after the kids were asleep and the fire was down to glowing embers, Silas placed a handwritten letter on Amala's desk. He didn't tell her, just left it there. It read, "You arrived on my coldest morning. I thought I was saving you, but it was you who brought the warmth back into this house. And into me. Your mother gave me a gift once, though I didn't see it clearly back then. Now I do. She gave me you. I may not be perfect. I may not have all the right words, but I will always be here. Dad." Amala never said anything when she read it, but that night she placed a new drawing on the fridge. This one drawn by Lawand. It showed a house, 5 smiling figures, and in bold letters across the top, "Home." Because sometimes the family we need most is the one we find along the way. And sometimes love doesn't rescue us all at once. It arrives like morning light, one small, steady ray at a time. Thanksgiving arrived with a hush of morning fog and the smell of cinnamon in the air. The town slowed down. Cars moved slower, people lingered longer in coffee shops, and the trees stood bare and proud, their work for the year complete. In the Langston home, the kitchen was alive. Nandi wore her holiday apron with the embroidered pumpkins and hummed old hymns as she basted the turkey. The oven beeped. The babies, no longer babies really, giggled underfoot, sneaking pieces of cornbread from the counter. Amala was at the sink peeling sweet potatoes, the sleeves of her sweater pushed up, cheeks pink from the oven heat. She had grown into herself, a young woman no longer haunted but whole. Silas sat at the table, glasses low on his nose, helping Boule write her gratitude list on a large sheet of paper. She was spelling slowly. Family, soup, books. Baba, around 4 o'clock, the table was set. Candles flickered in glass jars, plates mismatched in a charming, lived-in way. A centerpiece of leaves, pine cones, and 3 little handprint turkeys sat proudly in the middle. Guests trickled in, neighbors, friends from the scholarship program, one of Amala's professors. There was room for everyone. They said grace before the meal. Amala's voice gentle and steady, a little shaky near the end. Thank you for second chances, for warm kitchens and noisy dinners, for people who stay and people who come back to life. Silas blinked a few times, cleared his throat. I'm just grateful for cornbread, he joked, and everyone laughed through glassy eyes. That night, after the house quieted and the last bit of pie was tucked away in the fridge, Amala stepped out onto the porch. The stars were clear, the wind soft. Silas joined her, mugs of hot cider in hand. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The quiet, the way the house used to be." He looked out across the yard where the leaves rustled and the lights from the kitchen windows glowed golden behind them. "No," he said softly. "I don't miss the quiet. I think I mistook silence for peace, but this—" He gestured toward the sound of the triplets snoring inside, Nandi humming as she did dishes, the clink of plates and the soft creak of the old floors. "This is the sound of belonging." Amala leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's home," she said. Silas smiled, placing a hand gently over hers. "It always was. It just took a while for the right people to find their way here. Home is not built with walls, it is built with hands that hold, with voices that stay, with hearts that make room. The end. Or perhaps just the beginning." Years later, the porch still sings. The porch hadn't changed much. Same creaky swing, same view of the oaks that lined the driveway, now towering and wiser. The garden had grown thicker, full of perennials that returned year after year like old friends. Silas sat on the swing, older now. White hair neatly combed back, his cardigan a little too large on his thin frame. A mug of tea rested in his hand, half forgotten. He was watching the light, the way it fell through the golden leaves and landed softly on the worn floorboards. Inside the house, he could hear laughter, deeper now. Boulay was a teenager. Luan played piano, sometimes for hours. Anathi wanted to be a teacher. They all had grown taller, louder, funnier. And Amala, she was out back helping a young woman settle into the guest cottage. A new scholarship recipient. Another girl who had almost fallen through the cracks. Another second chance walking through the same front door. He leaned back slowly, the swing groaning in that familiar, comfortable way. He didn't need to go anywhere. He had gone far enough. There was something holy about staying in one place long enough to see things bloom. He took another sip of tea, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, smiling at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Amala. She sat beside him, a gentle sigh in her voice as she rested her hands on her knees. "You good?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I am." They didn't need many words anymore. Years of shared life had taught them how to sit in silence together. After a while, he spoke again, voice quiet. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone walking that morning." Amala looked at him, her face lit with evening light. "You did, though, and we found each other. That's what matters." Inside, the kettle whistled gently, and Nandi, older but just as spirited, called out through the kitchen, "Who wants tea?" Silas laughed, his chest light. "Still can't believe she stayed all these years," Amala smiled. "Family stays," Silas replied, eyes twinkling. "Even when they pretend it's just for the scones." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the porch, and the swing rocked gently, carrying them through the quiet, like memory. Some stories don't end. They settle in, like warmth in the walls, like a song the porch never forgets. It was early spring again. A soft drizzle tapped gently on the roof, and the magnolia tree by the front steps had begun to bloom, first buds shy and white, like they were still thinking about it. Inside, the old house hummed with familiar energy. The triplets, no longer the triplets, but young adults now, were home from college for the weekend. Luand was in the music room playing a melody that felt like memory. Boulay had brought home a stack of children's books from her early education program, arranging them on the coffee table like sacred artifacts. And Anathi, quiet, thoughtful Anathi, was baking on her own, without Nandi supervising. The smell of lemon loaf drifted through the house like sunlight. Amala stood in the hallway barefoot, holding a steaming cup of tea. Her hair was pulled back and she wore Silas's old cardigan-like armor. Soft, a little baggy and warm in all the right places. She glanced toward the study. Silas was there as always, sitting by the window with his notebook. He didn't write much these days, but he still kept the habit. The pen moved slowly across the page like a gentle conversation with himself. She stepped in quietly. "Need a refill?" she asked, nodding toward his empty cup. He looked up, eyes warm. "No," he smiled. "I'm full." They sat for a while, watching the rain together. There were framed photos on the shelves now. Amala's college graduation, the triplets at a science fair, Silas holding a baby wrapped in blue, the first child born to one of their scholarship recipients. Legacy, living and breathing. Later that afternoon, guests began to arrive for a small garden gathering. Just family, friends, and a few of the students from the foundation. Tables were set beneath strings of soft lights and music played from an old record player in the corner of the porch. It was the anniversary of the day Amala was found in the park. They called it Gratitude Day. Not to remember the pain, but to honor the path. Nandi gave a speech, though she insisted she wasn't the speaking type. Everyone cried anyway. Silas stood slowly, cane in hand, voice still steady. "I used to think I had lost everything," he said, looking around the garden, filled now with people, stories, and laughter. "But I was just waiting for the rest of the story." He raised his glass. "To the ones who come into our lives like a whisper and stay like a prayer." As dusk settled and the lights twinkled like stars caught in branches, Amala stepped aside with Boule, watching the scene unfold. "You okay, Mama?" Boule asked softly. Amala nodded. "Just full." Boule smiled. "He says that too." Amala turned toward the house, the same porch, the same windows glowing from within, but now filled with 1,000 layers of memory, because home isn't made in a day. It's built in seasons by hands that stay, hearts that soften, and stories that never stop unfolding. The bell rang softly. It was an old school in a small rural town, walls painted sunshine yellow, chipped here and there by time, but still standing strong. Birds flitted across the low roof. The air smelled faintly of chalk, pine trees, and hand sanitizer. Boule Langston, now 23, glasses perched on her nose, curls tucked into a bright scarf, stood at the front of the classroom. Her heart beat a little faster than usual. Her first teaching job. The room was filled with tiny desks, faded posters of animals and alphabets, and a group of wide-eyed second graders who didn't yet know how much she already loved them. Before class began, she opened her bag and carefully placed a photo on the edge of her desk. A picture of her as a little girl, sitting on Silas's lap, crayon in hand, smiling wildly at something off camera. Underneath it, a note he had once written: "Lead with warmth, not noise. Children remember how you made them feel, not what you said." She took a deep breath and smiled. It wasn't an easy class. Some children came in without breakfast. Others carried things too heavy for their tiny shoulders, absent parents, anger they couldn't name, homes that were loud in all the wrong ways. But Boule saw them, because once someone had seen her too. On Friday afternoon, she started a little ritual. She called it quiet story time, not to make the room quiet, but to let little hearts breathe. She read them stories about courage, kindness, and second chances, about a girl who once lived in a cold park and found a home in the unlikeliest place. She never said it was her, but one of the students, a quiet boy named Denzel, once raised his hand and whispered, "Did she ever go back to the park to say thank you to the bench?" The class giggled. Boule laughed too, then answered quietly, "I think the best way to thank a place is to become someone who builds new ones." That night she wrote to Amala, a short email, just a picture of her classroom with a simple caption, "Your love lives here too." Back home, Amala opened the message while stirring soup. Silas, now mostly retired and spending afternoons in the garden, peeked over her shoulder and smiled. Nandi, walking by with a tray of freshly baked scones, added, "Told you that girl would change the world. One gentle voice at a time. Sometimes the children we save become the ones who save others. And kindness, when planted well, becomes a forest that never stops growing." It was a Tuesday afternoon when she arrived. Her name was Talia, 17, suitcase in one hand, a letter of acceptance in the other. She stood outside the black iron gates of the Langston house, coat too big for her frame, eyes darting like someone who wasn't used to being welcomed. The air smelled like rain-soaked leaves and warm bread from the kitchen inside. The gate buzzed open. Amala met her at the steps. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. "You must be Talia. Welcome home." Talia didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. "Is this really where I'm staying?" she asked. Amala smiled, not rushing her. "If you want it to be, no pressure, just warmth." That night, Talia sat at the edge of the bed in the guest room. She didn't unpack. The room smelled like lavender and fresh linen. A small nightlight glowed by the bookshelf. There were picture frames, children playing in the yard, Amala in graduation robes, Silas holding a tiny baby with wrinkled feet and a wrinkled smile. It was all too soft, too unfamiliar. She sat still, listening. Downstairs, someone laughed, deep and kind. The clink of teacups, a spoon stirring, music playing softly on an old vinyl. It wasn't silence she was used to, it was safety. The days passed gently. Nandi showed her how to make lemon muffins. Boule dropped off old poetry books with underlined passages. Silas left her a note beside the kettle each morning. "Good thoughts brew better with tea." S.L. Amala didn't ask about her past. She only ever asked, "How's your heart today?" Some days Talia answered. Some days she just shrugged, but she always showed up. And somehow, that counted. One rainy evening after dinner, Silas found her in the sunroom. She was sitting cross-legged, drawing quietly in a sketchbook. Her lines were bold, yet unsure, like someone rediscovering their voice. He sat across from her, holding a warm mug of chai. "I used to think quiet girls didn't have much to say," he said. "Turns out they're just saving it for the right time." Talia looked up, a small smirk at the corner of her lips. "I don't really trust nice people." "That's okay," Silas replied, sipping his tea. "We're not in a rush." Weeks later, she hung one of her drawings on the fridge. A sketch of the house shaded in warm tones with soft figures sitting on the porch swing, light spilling from the kitchen window. At the bottom corner, she had written just one word: belonging. Every soul that walks through the door brings something lost and finds something lasting. And the house, it just keeps holding space for it all. Autumn had returned with its golden hush and the scent of burning wood curling through the air. The trees in the Langston garden had begun to let go of their leaves, and the swing on the porch rocked gently in the breeze as if remembering. Silas had been sleeping more lately, not from illness, at least not one that doctors could name, just age, a soft slowing, a kind of quiet that only comes to those who have given all they came to give. He spent most of his days in the sunroom now, wrapped in his favorite cardigan. A blanket over his knees, a book on his lap he rarely read. But his eyes were alive, always watching the light move through the windows, always listening to the voices in the kitchen, the piano in the next room, the laughter of children in the yard. One morning, Amala found an envelope on her writing desk, her name on the front written in familiar looping script. Amala inside was a letter handwritten, the paper slightly yellowed, the ink just a little shaky. She sat down to read it, slowly, like you sip something sacred. My dearest Amala, if you're reading this, then I've likely stepped into the next room. Don't worry, nothing's broken. I'm just further down the path. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we met and how you brought life back into this house. How you brought laughter where there was silence, music where there was grief, light where there was only shadow. You see, I thought I had reached the end of my story, but then you showed up with 3 babies, trembling hands, and a heart stronger than steel. And suddenly my ending became a new beginning. You made me a father again, not by blood but by grace. Bule, Luand, Anathi. They are my heart. And you are my legacy. Promise me you'll keep the door open for the next lost soul, for the next miracle in need of a porch light. Let this house remain a place where second chances live and love is never wasted. And when you miss me, just sit by the swing at sunset. I'll be there, rocking gently with you in the golden quiet. Thank you for giving me a family, for letting me matter again. I love you all. Always. Silas Langston. She pressed the letter to her chest, tears falling silently. Not from sorrow alone, but from a fullness words couldn't hold. The funeral was small, intimate, held beneath the magnolia tree he loved. Bule read a poem she'd written. Anathi played a soft piece on the violin. Luan stood tall and placed a sketch of Silas beside the tree, drawn from memory, smiling, eyes crinkled, hands outstretched. At the end, Amala stepped forward. She didn't say much, just one thing. He didn't rescue us. He reminded us that we were never broken. In the weeks that followed, life slowly wrapped around the quiet again. The house still smelled of bread and warm coffee. Talia stayed. Others came. And every evening as the sun dipped low, the porch swing swayed softly, never empty, because someone always sat there. Sometimes Bule grading papers, sometimes Amala writing letters to the foundation students, sometimes no one, just the wind and memory and love. Sometimes life gives us a second chance in the most unexpected way, not wrapped in perfection but in need. A quiet knock at the door, a trembling hand reaching out. When we choose to open our hearts, to let someone in, we don't just change their life, we rediscover meaning in ours. This story reminds us that no one is ever too old, too tired, or too broken to begin again. That love, when given freely, becomes a shelter for others and for ourselves. Maybe we can't fix the whole world, but we can make one home warmer, one heart safer, one child feel seen. And in doing so, we leave behind something far more lasting than wealth or legacy. We leave behind love that echoes long after we're gone. So if your porch light is still on, keep it burning. Someone out there may be searching for it. And when they arrive, trembling and unsure, say what Silas once did. You're safe now. That's what matters.